Hello ladies and gentlemen, LEC is starting again and I wanted to give a rundown of the changes that are coming your way. Of course, I'm going to do, a little bit of discussion on the teams and what has changed in terms of the game and what to expect, in my opinion, about, of course, the teams and the players. And I'm going to give a rundown of the format because a lot of things are new. So, of course, Fearless is continuing. That is something that is global. Fearless is global and it is here to stay. Fantastic for, of course, the format that EU is presenting here. We have a single round robin best of 3, which is going to be played over quite a bit of time. So Spring Split is the longer split, and it allows for great things like these roadshows. Roadshows, very, very important for the game. I think that most players make their greatest memories on these roadshows, and it's something that I miss so much because back when I played, my first opening match, which was a regular season game against Gambit, was also a roadshow. I played in the Zenith in Lille. It was a wooden arena, 10,000 people. It's fantastic. It was just a beautiful experience. I will never forget that. And I think to have everyone in the same place, funneling their energy into the same thing, it is a sight to behold. And I think this is how you create long-term fans. So we're going to have one in Madrid, where the matches are going to be G2 versus Giant X, Movistar Koi versus Fnatic, and then G2 versus Fnatic, Movistar Koi versus Giant X, which is super cool. Some teams get to play, some teams don't get to play. And then Karmine, you have G2 versus SK, Karmine versus Team Vitality, a little French derby action, Team Vitality versus SK, and then Karmine versus G2, which is, of course, an ultra giga banger. Karmine is hosting the event, of course, in France, the French capital, to the town of Evry. I have no idea what that is, but probably it's fantastic. And then you have, of course, Movistar Koi hosting in Madrid, which is a great way of leveraging these fantastic and massive fan bases, which is just, really well done. I think this was a very, very good move. And I think it brings back some of the things that we fell in love with, because obviously these matches in the studio, these finals in the studio, they stink. And hopefully with this, maybe you can move to a point where a lot of the teams who have big enough fan bases to host their own, events, actually have, the courtesy to take over some of this work from Riot, because obviously they seems like Riot wants to cut cuts on everything. But KC and Koi is definitely like, these are teams that can definitely make it work. So that's super cool. The follow-up from the single round robin best of 3, 6 teams qualified to playoffs. 2 of them go into the lower bracket as pictured here, and then 4 of them are going to be in the upper bracket. Very, very standard bracket. We've seen this in the past. And I think it's a fantastic format. Super cool. Fearless is going to continue. And of course, we have best of 3s and then best of 5s in the playoffs. And this is going to lead to the qualification of EWC and also MSI. In terms of where the teams are at, obviously, there's certain things that have changed, I think, to highlight where we're at in the game. We are continuing with Fearless, so a lot of the things that teams showed in Fearless are going to be, of course, relevant here. Coaching staff is going to be tested, continue to be tested. We saw great moments of brilliancy, for example, from G2, especially from KC as well. In the finals, it seemed like they just had G2 on the ropes. And then we saw massive blunders too, like the Misfortune Lulu from Fnatic. And, we saw all spectrums of, drafting. I think a crucial detail is that, in a lot of the playoffs, you saw great teams falter in draft. And that is something that I think over time, teams and coaches are going to be, of course, a lot more used to Fearless. And I think there's a lot to expand on and a lot to learn on. But of course, as you go deeper into the series, the amount of mutations in drafts that will appear in terms of the champions and how deep you must go to make sure that the draft makes sense is always going to be a challenging aspect of Fearless. But I'm excited to see more Fearless. Let's talk about the teams and how it might affect things. I guess an additional thing that I should notice and point to is that there is no more lane swap. There were 2 teams that stood out as, in my opinion, really good lane swap teams. I think the main one that stands out is, of course, G2. G2 had the Civilulu strat. The teams banned away, and I think in terms of tank play, Broken Blade is definitely the guy. I think that KC also did a good job of playing lane swap scenarios, even though they weren't necessarily the ones to force them. They were in tune with main ideas in terms of timings to dive and so forth. But now it's very pure. It's going to be lane phase. You still have the restrictions in terms of lane swaps, where you kind of can't even roam into mid as a support before the 330 mark. Lane swapping is just completely removed from the game. I'm not going to talk too much about the patch because, 2506 Something I can add, I guess, is that we've been seeing a lot of Nafiri in the LPL, and we've been seeing a lot of Gwen blind pick. These champions seem super, super strong. And other than that, nothing else really, really stands out as something, new beyond the regular. It seems like Kalista Prio is a little bit lower, and teams are willing to drop and play Ashe and Varus into it, and a lot of melee supports. No crazy, double range AD carry support, because obviously these things got very, very nerfed in the past when they lowered the strength of Serrated Dirk, lowered the strength of, support items in general, gold generation, all of these things were nerfed in the past. Support items were incredibly powerful, and you were given 1,000 gold for free through your support item. But let's talk about the team. So KC, reigning champion. I think that in terms of KC, obviously they're an S tier. They're a contender for the title here in spring, naturally, because I think their solo laners are fantastic players. I think in terms of their identity as a team, it's something that is very well formed and well shaped. I think that they had some struggles at first stand, but I don't think it's really relevant. I think that performing at that tournament was very difficult for everybody involved. It was a logistical nightmare. It was a patch nightmare. It was a lot of things at the same time, the format being bad. I think in terms of the fluctuating performances from all of the teams outside of maybe, of course, CFO and How Alive, there was a risk of that in this tournament. KC found themselves, and they managed to push through, and they managed to clinch out that game 5 against CFO, which was incredibly impressive. I think Kana, Vladi, as crazy as it might sound at this point in time, in order to beat G2 convincingly as they did, you need to be able to contest them in the solo lanes. And I think that Kana and Vladi is a very, very powerful pair. I think that Targamas and, Kalist, I think in terms of the lane phase, I was skeptical to some degree because of how they played against Fnatic. But it seemed, there were games where Targamas played Karma, and they played against, of course, top esports, and they managed to break them, which is a very, very good thing and a good sign, because it means that they can work together with the jungle to find really good gank timers. So even though I think that from the get-go, I think the Targamas Kalista specialty is not necessarily the lane. I think the key advantage that Kalist and Targamas have is that they have a very, very wide range of champions they are effective on. Most of the time, we see Targamas playing, of course, melee supports to make the composition very, very cohesive, because they need, people to do the dirty work, like the Maokai, the Scanner, the Rel, the Leonas, to make sure that the composition always has engage, ways to face check, ways to tank, and so forth. So I think this is obviously very, very, crucial. But they showcased, some range support action. We saw Targamas on Senna, which was fantastic, Targamas on Kama. And I think that in terms of their strength, I think their depth in champion pool is their biggest edge, but not necessarily like the laning against the rest of the field. When I say rest of the field, I'm talking about Fnatic specifically, because I think that Mickey and Upset in terms of laning are insanely, insanely good. And Mickey said on, of course, our Sackdown episode with him that they invest a lot of time into dual queuing and breaking down all of the matchups, and the investment really, really pays off. In terms of looking back at, of course, Winter, Fnatic and KC was the closest series. That was a series that could have, ended differently if Game 5 played out differently. Obviously, I'm not being a hindsight Andy. I'm just saying it was close. Obviously, the Volibear and the draft, these are the type of mistakes that only happen once. And that's the type of series you kind of wish to see again. While I think on paper, Fnatic have I think in terms of what the roster is, I do think that there is chances for them to be, called a favorite for spring due to the changes of no lane swap. But as long as, I don't have full faith in Razork to push it over the line, and I'm going to, of course, hold back, because KC managed to do it. They managed to push through. They managed to take the opportunities that they were given, and they're playing with a level of confidence that I really, really love seeing. A very important detail in terms of talking about KC is the fact that now they are no longer the underdog. Everyone's going to view them differently, treat them differently. When you are no longer the underdog and you expect to perform at all times, this comes with a new pressure. It's kind of like defending the championship in the UFC. A common thing that is always said is that it's easier to become the champion than to stay the champion, because obviously everyone's kind of breathing down your neck and everyone's trying to figure out your game, beat you specifically, and you're going to be studied in a very, very different way. That's why what G2 was, their streak was so impressive, because obviously everyone in the league tried to beat them, but they just couldn't come close and they couldn't do it. And as long as Fnatic is plagued by that, it's hard for me to push them anywhere beyond this mark. But I do think that Fnatic, in terms of their ceiling, in terms of their precision of play and so forth, is extremely high. It's just that the lows are extremely low too. And that is, of course, a painful aspect here. The next team, for me, I'm putting G2 third. I think that some of the issues that Labrov showcased, I think that G2 did a great job of hiding all of their weaknesses and flaws when it came to, of course, their, game, when it comes to the conversation of pretty much, you're in a situation where Labrov has a very limited champion pool, which I think will make him suffer in Fearless. I think that when teams figure out the right bans, removing the Lulu Sivir as a combo, I think that G2, in terms of their depth, especially in the bot lane department, is something that is concerning. Fearless is continuing, and the main thing that makes me very hopeful for G2 is, of course, the pieces that have won in the past. I do think Hansama stepped up a lot previous split, and I think that, BB and Caps are people that you can never count out. And additionally, I think that their coaching staff has enough of a pedigree that even though that finals didn't look that great in terms of the preparation, and the fact that they gave away that information to KC in scrims that allowed them to prepare so easily against them and just annihilate them completely in the prep department, I do think that this is a coaching staff that can definitely find very, very unique angles to attack teams, and especially when they have a clear target. This is the first time G2 is coming into a split as an underdog, and it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. I think the Skumond is someone that got a lot of flack for his missed smites. There's definitely like moments where he's at fault, moments where his whole team is at fault, including him. But I do think that in terms of his gameplay overall, he does very, very sound jungling, wastes very little time, is very precise with gank timers, is keeping up with farm super, super well, and goes through the rhythm of the game super well. But the main concern for G2, of course, is how Labrov and Skumond impact the map in terms of giving space to a player like Caps and BB. This team works the best when BB is now creating space for the team, and he's kind of filling in the gap of Labrov, and they kind of made it to the finals by making the role of Labrov as simple as possible. This was a big concern of mine when you let go of a player like Mickey. Even though Mickey's volume wasn't the greatest, whenever it came to a very important series, whether it was regional finals, whether it was MSI, even Worlds, I do think that Mickey always played better than any other support could out of Europe. And now when they're playing on these final matches, these big stages, because BB and Caps are going to get you there, you need to be able to perform. And as long as Labrov hasn't done that, I am concerned for that. And I think that Hansama, although he had a fantastic split, it is very clear that the champion pool kind of runs out of gas when it comes down to it. So I'm curious to see now in full effect the Labrov-Hansama lane phase, because this is something that, of course, was a big selling point. And additionally, even though I talk about the champion pool in terms of the depth of it, similar to Gumeyushi, I think Hansama is basically like European Gumeyushi in a sense. I do think that some of the champions that he's extremely proficient on, like the Draven, the Kalista, are going to be insanely important weapons, and that is going to draw a lot of bans in a scenario where you can't lane swap away from it. So it's going to be intriguing to see how that, of course, develops, because Hansama likes to play MF, he likes to play Jhin, likes to play Varus, likes to play, of course, the Draven and the Caitlyn. These are very lane-oriented picks, so I can definitely see an angle where G2 become a contender again. But we shall see. We shall see. So I think these three teams are the ones to look out for. I think, honestly, the gap after that is quite wide. I think Koi comes to mind. The main question for me is the ceiling of the squad. I think that when it comes to the bot lane and Elioya, I think Elioya had a very, very strong split. I think the bot lane, when they can push and take over the map together with the jungle, I think that they have some of the coolest early games that we see in the league, and this has been true for this alteration of Koi for a very, very long time. The big question mark for me here, of course, is Jojo Pyun and his performance. I think in terms of 2v2 lane, there's a lot of things that Alvaro and, of course, Super do that is questionable. I remember the 2v2 specifically against KC, where they gave up a double kill by overreaching on a trade. I think in terms of the precision of champion choices, it is a little bit wacky. It's like, for example, I didn't like the Kaiser Braum combo that they kind of laid out. They have their own style, but sometimes it feels a little bit overcooked. And I do think that Midwin is definitely a player that benefits from being in lane, because obviously he couldn't pick his wacky Nidalee, Varus, or Koki top because he was always afraid of a potential lane swap. So that is going to be super exciting. I think the best version of Koi can be the one that where Midwin basically plays all of his, cool champions. I think that could be an angle where Koi could step up, and additionally Giorgio Pion finding form, because I was very, very disappointed with his arrival, because week 1 was solid, but then week 2 just got worse, week 3 got worse, and then he went back to comfort to try to kind of have some kind of impact, but it was far too late, especially when the field of mid laners is quite powerful. I feel like maybe I talked a little bit too little about Fnatic, because I talk about them so much. So I feel like a lot of things have been said, but I mentioned the bot lane. I think Oscarinin as well had a fantastic split. I think in terms of where the top lane landed, the top 3, Oscarinin, BB, and of course Kana, that's a fantastic top 3 top lane. I feel like the competition in top lane has never been so well-rounded. Usually it's like, oh, Wunder Bwipo, Wunder Soaz, and then like the rest of the names is like gone. So it's very cool that the top 3 is so powerful. And I think Oscarinin had a beautiful split. I think he's the main reason why they beat BDS in that disgusting series that they had against BDS. And obviously those series being a thing is a cause for concern for Fnatic. And that's always like what you kind of wrestle with. It's like, is Fnatic going to find a level of consistency and find a bar that makes sense? Will they be able to approach things with discipline? Something that I didn't mention as well is that they hired Duffman. A big point of, a big question mark was always like, is there enough staff, or do they have the right people involved? And Duffman, of course, was a person that really, really revitalized how G2 approached the game. And I think that he can basically create the boundaries that they need to play their macro game in, because this is what Duffman specializes in. You remember the shift from G2 in the first year that they played with the Yak Mickey Hansama roster, and then into the second year, they became a very, very different team, controlled, and of course, very, very farm-oriented, rather than the team that just smash bot lane, snowball, roam with Mickey, and just dive everywhere, right? But that obviously didn't work on a international stage. So Koi, I'm going to put them B. In terms of the next one in line, I guess it's like we kind of have a pool of teams here in the middle. I do think that BDS is kind of next to Koi. I can see them being here. BDS, I do think in terms of where they landed, especially with Paros's performance and also Irrelevant's performance, I do feel like they didn't really hit the mark in terms of where my expectations are. I think that the fact that there is going to be no lane swap is going to let them play more cookie cutter drafts, and I think this is like the striker specialty. When I say cookie cutter, is basically a draft a draft format that kind of replicates itself within itself, and I think as long as BDS play according to a set pattern, I do think that this is a team that can out-discipline others, but I do think that the impact of Irrelevant and Paros was too little and too inconsistent at many, many times. I was very impressed with 113, honestly. I think that he did a great job of keeping this team competitive, especially against the team, against the competition in Fnatic. It was very absurd to see Irrelevant end the season with, end the split with playing fucking Garen. That was very, very absurd. There was an homage to Adam, which was very, very strange. But I do think players like Nuke, players like Ice, and of course 113, as I mentioned, I do think that they set a pretty solid base. And I think that that's the main thing for me. They have a very solid base, and that's chill. I do think that they should, make it into top 5, so to speak. But I don't see a world ever where they break it into the top 3, because I think that they can just out macro them. They just out macro them, because I do think that these 3 teams just play the game at a high level. Let's continue. Now it's where it gets a little bit more difficult, but let's talk about some of the changes that comes through. So Vitality, they have added Niski as their support. And while I have a deep appreciation for Niski and his leadership qualities and how he can affect a team in terms of the intangibles, I do think that this comes and carries a lot of risk, especially in a world where there's no longer lane swap. You guys remember Kedro? It's like when Kedro jumped into the super role. Obviously, I think Niski is a better player than Kedro. He made playoffs after all. Um, Kedro figured it out by lane swapping. Keep in mind, this is going to be fearless and it is going to be lanes only. And if there's anything Hilly is great at, it's laning. And when Cards and Hilly lane together, they were fantastic. They could contest with everybody in the league. They did a very, very good job when it came down to laning and they got advantage out of it. A lot of the issues always stemmed from later parts in the game. So while I understand if you want to kind of play, the reason game as to why Vitality might have done this change, it seems like there's kind of a fundamental difference in terms of how they want to approach the game with Hilly, which, okay, to each their own. But I think that when you think about Fearless and it being standard lane over and over again, there's going to be a lot of knowledge that Niski is going to be missing. If Niski managed to execute this, I'm going to be so damn impressed. Like if he has a good Leona, good Nautilus, good Rel, good Alistar, and then follows that up with a solid Renata and a Poppy potentially in some pockets, and then being able to play the range supports like the Lulu and the Karma, and play all these interesting matchups like the Lucianami, maybe pick Millie on some slots, I would be extremely impressed. I would be extremely impressed by that because it's insanely difficult, and I am predicting that this is going to be, a very, very, there's going to be growing pains here for Vitality. I think that Nako is a very strong player. I think it's very interesting. Chayek, I think that he was solid and he had some good moments. I think Linsas is also solid, and I wonder how the Linsas Niski kind of situation would pan out. I can't imagine Niski as a person and as a voice in the game could maybe help with Vitality's macro. But the question is, will he play good enough to get his foot through the door in the first place? Because if he can't execute mechanically, that is going to also, limit how much he can communicate in the game. So this is going to be very challenging for Niski. And if he manages to pull it off, damn. But maybe this is the kind of move where you hope that this is going to pay off in, of course, the long run. And I'm not so sure about that. So Vitality in C. Let's talk about what's next. We have Giants. I think Giants belong in C2. Giants, of course, closer cited, it's been cited it was like personal reasons why he stepped down, and they have brought in Isma. So Isma, I think that his time on SK, I think that he had pretty decent early games. And that's about it, decent early games. And Giants as a team, I do think that usually, when we look back at the previous split, they kind of won because they were playing fights better mechanically. That was like the only thing that they had going for them. And Noah and June having being put in a lane only scenario. They're one of the few bot lanes that have a lot of fucking experience together here in the league. Like Supa and Alvaro is like comparable, but Noah and June have played so much together, and I think that's going to be super helpful for them. I think the Jackies kind of fell off a cliff after our Sackdown episode. I do think he's a player with potential, but I wonder, in terms of strategic depth, post 15-minute mark, I do feel like Giants gameplay became quite dull and very, very reactionary, depending what the enemy does. And there seems to be a clear lack of leadership there. And I don't know if Isma is going to be the player to provide that because previous Isma rosters lack that too. So I don't see a world where Isma is going to be a completely different player here in this one. I do think that Isma can maybe create circumstances where he has better early games, and through that maybe they can just muscle their way through by collecting dragons. But I didn't see a clear consistency and pattern in terms of how Giant X won games. And then eventually, as other teams built their identity, Giants kind of lost their identity completely, and maybe were exposed for not having one in the first place. So while I think Jackie has great potential as a player, I am intrigued about how this is going to play out. But I do feel like I have to put maybe Giants above Vitality based on what I said before. I am kind of worried about the Niski move, and I do think that comes with a lot of risk. SK Gaming, they have put in, if I remember correctly, right? It's like they put in, let me just remind myself, Kedui and Bukada. So Kedui was on Team BDS. He was the last player out of that Team BDS LFL roster to come through with Skumond and Paros, Kedui and Rika, and of course the top laner Bukada came out of KCB. I was surprised by this change because my impression was that the main driving forces for KCB, in my opinion, was the support. I think that the mid lane is also extremely interesting. Exakick very good. Mainter is good. I felt like Bukada was maybe the weakest piece based off the few games that I did watch. I preface this by saying I didn't watch a lot of the KCB games. I don't see a world where replacing Rahel is going to necessarily, make this roster feel revitalized and exciting again. I don't see a world where SK is going to be that much more interesting in comparison to previous times. So SK, I'm going to put the kind of on burn notice for me. So we'll have to see. I need to be impressed here because I think they're going to be facing a lot of the similar issues with maybe even a weaker early game due to the lack of Isma. I feel like, Rogue, kind of sick and tired of Rogue because I did see a potential upside with the roster that they built with Malrang and Execute and, of course, Adam. I think Adam in a non-lane swap meta can play his, god shit, like he plays Seth, Garen, Darius, and all that jazz, which could be interesting. And that makes Adam a little bit more dangerous, I do think. But it's incredible how Freddy has managed to even pacify this roster. It's truly a miracle how he managed to pacify a roster with Easy Hoon, not as Easy Hoon, Execute, Jesus, Jong Hoon. I don't know where I got Easy Hoon from. I guess it's like the Hoon similarity. And Malrang, it's so pacified. They had the rogue standard of doing nothing and praying type shit. Malrang doesn't seem to be the player that he once was. Of course, when he was winning splits and when he left, his time in Brazil didn't seem to serve him well. And, Rogue, I should be at the bottom here. Team Heretics, I think Rogue should be over Escado. Team Heretics, I do think, the biggest strength, it might sound like an insult, but the biggest strength of Team Heretics for me is just they were aware of how weak they are. And they drafted towards that and found a resemblance of identity, which allowed them to play more games, stay longer in the league, which I think is really good. This is a roster still that is building experience. And in terms of where the expectations are, I think that they have managed to, land in a good spot in terms of where the expectations are. So there's that. Nothing much to add about Team Heretics. I think the bottom end of the table is a little bit boring. And I'm hoping that we can get to the point where, there is a rotating guest spot that people can qualify into, where some teams are locked and some teams are not. Maybe a little Los Ratoni could make it all the way through here, which would be extremely, extremely fun and exciting. But there's that. I expect the spring split to go a little bit something like this. I do think that it's going to be extremely brutal for the teams that have tougher schedules in the beginning. Single round robin, best of threes. There is no way to fluke your way out of it. The cool thing about long formats with best of threes, single round robins, is that they are brutally fair, very, very fair. At the end of what we see on the table, most of the time is going to be what the skills of the teams are, maybe with like one ranking up and down, so forth, because a specific patch is landed just right. But single round robin best of three means that these lower end teams can't find some crazy angles. I'm very intrigued to see how KC, after first stand, the rest, and of course post tournament lag, and being the top dog, how they're going to treat and understand something, because Fnatic and G2 lying right behind them, there's definitely a world where they are going to be able to beat KC in a best of five when things and push comes to shove. but I think that KC have a very strong foundation. And the main thing for me when it comes to KC is how can they add additional champions to their pool that put them in that S level category, because they have certain champions that they just are fantastic on. And we'll see if they manage to figure out how to implement kind of playing tanks to the team, or if there's additional champions that Vladi can pull off at the same level as his Azir and Talia and even Koki. But these are worries for later. We will see how things panned out. I look forward to the LEC super much, and I hope that I can bring you guys some good news soon. With that being said, thank you for watching. I'll catch you guys on the next one and all the streams. All the best to all of you, and peace. Press the record off button.